This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. I would like to take a moment to talk about an exciting new project under the Chthonia banner, the Institute for the Study of Feminine Myth. Looking to bust the patriarchy? In order to bring feminine balance to our collective culture, we have to examine and rework our collective myths. The ISFM aims to do just that, and to help people find their own creative voices as part of a move towards new thought for the 21st century. Check out the GoFundMe link in the description box for both the audio and YouTube versions of the podcast for a full video on the project and an opportunity to donate to this important work. Hello, this is Dearg Due. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally. Politi, John H., Tanya T., Veronica S., Jeffrey B., Gabby, Helen M., Sunny H., Scott K., JRM, Susie G., Eldritch Priest, B. Lupita, C. Roberts, Jeanette, DS, Jake B., CDV, Allie, Thaddeus G., V! V, Mary Beth R., Ida B., Eric N., Tana, and May. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there's so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversation on the dark feminine, and extra content, so please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast that deals with the dark feminine. I'm your host, Dearg Due. And our episode this week is going to go back to looking at Irish folk tales, and we're going to look at a figure known as the Dearg Due, which is she's a vampire, is what she is. This is an Irish tale about a female vampire. And the tale itself is really quite interesting because it's said to originate from Celtic Ireland. Okay, so Celtic Ireland is a period of time that is, I want to say it kind of runs up against what we think of as the early medieval period in Europe, and probably goes back a couple hundred years BCE, maybe to about 300 BCE is when we see Celts really being the dominant force in Ireland. And this legend is probably from roughly around that time period. I mean, the date has not been given. I've not been able to find one. The only things that have been said that this is from a time when arranged marriages were common, and this seemed to be a marriage to a local chieftain. So given that, again, we're talking either the early centuries, maybe perhaps before Christianity came to Ireland, or maybe just in the early days. Christianity doesn't get a mention in here, so it's really hard to say. More than likely, it seems like it is more of a pre-Christian legend, but how terribly ancient it is unclear. But what I want to do is I want to tell you the story of the Dearg Due. Make sure I can say this correctly. And I'm sure there'll be somebody in Ireland who will say, no, it's not pronounced that way, because everybody may have it seems like in different parts, people have different ways of pronouncing it. But the name is said to mean something like the red thirst. Okay, Dearga is definitely the word for red here, and then the idea of thirst. And so again, there's this idea of being a bloodsucker, thirst for blood, really. Okay, so I'm going to read to you the version of the story of this vampire from emeraldisle.ie, and which has a collection of a lot of legends. I'm not always endeared by the way that they post it on their site. I mean, they're posting it certainly as storytellers with a much more Christian or Catholic inflection in the way that the stories are told, which again is not necessarily surprising. And of course, if that is definitely the vantage point or the view of the people who are creating the site, then it's not, that's not such a strange thing. But I always tend to prefer something that's a little less didactic in the way that it's presented. So we're gonna read that story. I'm gonna talk about that story, and then I want to talk about all the different elements of this story. I don't know if I always say this at the beginning of a podcast. I don't know how long this is going to be. this could be something, and it's funny because I have a crow who is like screaming in my window right at the same time as I'm talking about this, feeling like the Morrigan is sort of looking in here. But I want to talk about different elements of the story and what we might take away from stories like this that I think are meant to be a certain type of instructive tale, but maybe doesn't necessarily carry whatever the originally intended meaning might have been of this particular kind of a story. So let's start by talking about this. We'll read this version from emeraldisle.ie. And, okay, this is said to be a dark tale of a dreaded vampire, the Dearg Due. Actually, the Dearg Due. I don't remember there's an extra syllable there. The red thirst, the Dearg Due, was these 1,000 years gone by a young maiden of surpassing fairness. So this was a very beautiful woman who lived, now they're saying about 1,000 years ago. Bards sang songs of her skin as fair as springtime snow, and her lips as red as rubies in the light of the setting sun. Men came from far and wide to seek her hand in marriage. And yet, pretty as she was, her true beauty shone from within as kindly and gentle as she was. She fell deeply in love with a local peasant boy, and dreamed of his kisses day and night, but her father would have none of it. He married her off instead to a cruel man of great wealth, who was older yet than her father, but he paid a handsome bride price for her hand. Stories tell that he abused her terribly for his own amusement, and would do her harm just to watch the blood flow on her pale skin, and all the while the father sat counting his wealth gleefully. Confined to a tower, she pined sadly for her lost love, wondering when he would come to her rescue, but he could not and did not. Realizing this at long last, her heart broke and she resolved to end it all, so she put away and hid those small morsels of food that were given to her until her body failed and she died. The villagers knew what had to be done. They were to take the body and bury it under a tall pile of stones under what people now call Strongbow's tree. I should note that this is in Waterford in Ireland. But perhaps out of pity for the poor thing, they didn't, and simply let her lie in the earth. I'll tell you this much, though, their pity was misplaced, for was not the fair lost lass who arose from the earth that dark wind-haunted night, but a vengeful spirit from the underworld, with only the vaguest memories of who and what she had been. She went to her father's house and asked to be let in, and he, appalled, did so of his own free will, which in the way of things grants the revenant power over those within, and she sucked all the air from his body. Then she came upon her former husband, staggering home from the tavern, three sheets to the wind, and did the same to him, except she drank not only the air from his chest, but the blood from his veins as well. Invigorated by this ill-gotten life force, the dread spectre now walks the land of Ireland, enticing young men from their beds with enchanting dances and swirling mists before enfolding them in her grasp and draining them to the last drop. Those who go missing or fall mysteriously ill, those troubled by night fevers, all should suspect the Dearg Due as a culprit for their woes. The only cure is to find the grave of the beast and pile stones atop it as should have been done in the first place, and it will hold the red thirst at bay for a time. Okay, and they have a map where they show you where Strongbow's tree is. And of course, it is showing this in the area of Waterford. I'm just sort of bringing it in here. Actually, it's interesting. There's a key here that is along. Let's see which river this is. It looks like it's the Suir River. Yes, Suir River. Okay, and this is behind the key. There is a place. Looks like actually it's right, perhaps even in the center of town. Christchurch Cathedral. Apparently there's a tree there that's known as the Strongbow tree, and supposedly she's buried there, and that stones need to be piled on top of her grave in order to keep her from walking about. Okay, so that's the story. And now this story has a lot of, we're going to recognize a lot of elements of this story from other stories. Okay, for one thing, you have a woman who is, she's a woman who is of a particular stature who falls in love with somebody who is of a lower class than herself. Okay, somebody, and as we know, this is a time when marriages are made for money and not for love. And this is that tension between the woman who is married to the older man who she doesn't love, and being deprived of the love of the person that she truly cares for. And that theme alone suggests to me that this could be potentially, well, this certainly does seem to be a later type of story, because certainly we know a lot of the women of Celtic Ireland were, certainly when we're talking about the era of Brehon law, women certainly had a lot more freedom in terms of marriage and marriage choice. So this implies something that's a little bit more within the Christian era, within a period of time when women would have been forced into arranged marriages and not really having any options about getting out of them. And then so of course again, then we have the idea of the cruel husband who is the tyrant, and the young peasant who has no power. So the idea of a young woman whose sovereignty is taken away by this man who mistreats her. And of course, she is somebody who is a great beauty, so she is she is like a prize. She's like an object, okay? She's something that, it's the shiny object that he's buying. He doesn't actually treat her like a person. He treats her like a thing that he can use and abuse as he chooses, at least according to the story. And similarly, the father is guilty because he's willing to sell her off, and he's not interested in her feelings or her welfare, which again was probably not particularly uncommon if we look at it from a historical perspective of arranged marriages generally in families that had some kind of wealth or position. So some things to recall here. Again, this is a common motif, and the girl who wants her lost love. How many ghost stories do we hear of the woman, gazing out the window, waiting for her lover? Now, there's different variations of this. There's variations in which her lover has, gone off to sea or something, or gone to war and not returned. There are frequent ones where she has a tryst with a farmhand or with somebody who is on the who is considered to be of the servant class, and outrages her family by deciding by falling in love and maybe planning to elope. There's many stories like this within English, Irish, Welsh folklore, Scottish folklore. These stories exist, and probably not just there as well. You probably can find some kind of anthropological site. In fact, I think there might be one that exists that potentially there's like a tool that actually might let you plot these kinds of stories and see where these tales are. I saw this mentioned in a conference. I'm going to have to look that up again because it just sounds like it's really a cool thing. Okay, so she's married to someone who mistreats her. Now, how does she handle this event? Okay, she handles it through starvation. Starvation is the tactic that she uses. Now, if we think back to the podcast that we did on Catherine of Siena, the saint, who went into a convent, who never married. She went into a convent. Okay, so if we think about Catherine of Siena, now in her story, she has a sister. She's the youngest of it was a huge family. I forget how many children her mother had. I forget what the number was, but it was an incredibly large number of children. So what happened is one of her older sisters had a husband, and then when this husband mistreated her, the way that she handled it would be to stop eating and to starve herself, and that this was a way of getting her husband's attention. Similarly, Catherine of Siena would do a very, very similar thing. Now, of course, she had a kind of a fast where she felt like she had like a spiritual nourishment more than a physical nourishment. Nonetheless, you have this idea of using starvation as a tactic to try to manipulate a controlling husband. Okay, when you have a husband who is not allowing you sovereignty, because the one thing you do have sovereignty over, this is like saying, okay, that they don't have sovereignty over the person's death. That person is able to make that kind of a choice. So the fact that she died in this manner, interestingly enough, means that there seems to be folklore around the idea that she is that somebody who dies in this manner will become a vampire. So, okay, so what does that mean exactly? That a woman who takes control of her own death will then become a vampire? The one who doesn't have, whose life and death is not, who takes her sovereignty back in some way, is now a figure that is that is now dangerous. if we think about female figures that are draining of life, whether it be through something sexual, whether it be through the drinking of blood, we do see other figures like this, like like the Bavanshi in Scotland, who don't have this particular backstory, but nonetheless, but there is elements of the Dearg Due story that actually mirror the Bavanshi and the idea that they will show up as like this kind of whirling mist, or this beautiful woman who will, dance with or enchant the man who goes by and then drain him of his life. So she becomes almost a kind of vampire / succubus kind of figure. The feminine that devours life rather than the feminine that gives it. Okay? And the fact that when you talk about female vampires, this is certainly one way to look at it. Now, what's interesting is that this story probably would be regarded as a different type of cautionary tale. If we think about vampires and vampire stories, vampirism is often connected to narcissism. Think about when we use the phrase emotional vampire, okay? When there's this idea that you, or somebody who is or a psychic vampire, or an energy vampire, like somebody who drains you of something. Someone who makes you feel exhausted, tired, anxious, worn out. Okay, even forgetting about actually drinking blood, which is not, I don't know, supposedly there are vampires out there who do stuff like this. Not necessarily attacking people and biting them in the neck, but that you do hear about people who do drink blood and so forth. So, but I wouldn't suggest that is any kind of common thing. And certainly when we're talking about a dead being that drinks blood, obviously, this is in the realm of folklore. Whether it has any veracity or not is something, again, I'm sure you will hear about experiences of people who say that they have encountered vampires, and I don't necessarily, as I've said with other stories, I don't necessarily dismiss those stories, but at the same time, I recognize that there's this kind of folkloric theme or element that goes through it. And really the way that I see this story is I feel like what the message might have been, or what the original message might have been. It's more the idea that of shaming this girl for love based on attraction rather than having an arranged marriage that's based on financial gain. And again, it's this tension between the sovereignty of the woman and her connection to the family, particularly to her father. And it's interesting because there's a lot of talk about the Oedipus complex, Freud's Oedipus complex, where Freud will describe it as the child who wants to kill his father and marry his mother, right? And Jung had talked about something comparable for women known as the Electra complex, where they have this devotion to their father, which we see in the story in the Oresteia, where Electra, who is the sister of Orestes and the daughter of Agamemnon, has this kind of worship of her father, and when her mother murders the father, she's the one, at least in one version, who pushes Orestes to murder her mother as an act of vengeance, to avenge their father, who she practically worships. But here we have almost another version of the what we would think of mythologically as the incest / cannibalism variety of story. Now, in these stories, as I have mentioned, if we talk about them as ancestral type narratives, or if we talk about the idea of humans and the importance of human lineage and the importance of family lines, particularly when you're talking about aristocratic family lines. In Greek myth, as I've mentioned, the two major myth cycles that highlight this are connected to the house of Atreus and then to the house of, related to Thebes, the house of Cadmus. And actually the house of Atreus begins with, and I always feel like I'm getting this, I want to say, it begins with Tantalus, right? Because that's the house that is basically corrupted by cannibalism. Tantalus being the first one to actually commit this act of cannibalism by cooking and killing his son and trying to feed him to the gods. And the gods, of course, are horrified. They do resurrect the son, and then Tantalus is confined, interestingly, to eternal hunger and thirst in the depths of the underworld. Okay, but this taint goes through his family, because then his son Pelops also commits transgressions against Xenia or hospitality. And then we see another example of Atreus himself when he's fighting with his brother Thyestes for the kingship of the house of Mycenae. This is the Mycenaean saga. When he's fighting his brother for it, his brother takes it, takes it. It's not really his. He's not really supposed to be the king or the chieftain, but he cheats his way into it and has somebody help him. But then this is all reversed by a miraculous incident in which the sun ends up setting in the east and rising in the west. And when that happens, then this is the event that allows Atreus to take the kingship back. And he punishes Thyestes by capturing his nephew, cooking and killing him, and then feeding him to Thyestes. And once Thyestes realizes that this is what's happened, he curses him. And then you have, this is when he goes and he ends up having sex with his own daughter at the advice of the Oracle of Apollo. Yes, this is all part of this, so there's the incest piece too. And that's where Aegisthus is born. Aegisthus is the one who plots with Clytemnestra, Agamemnon's wife, to murder Agamemnon when he comes home, because Aegisthus himself wants to seize power. This is how he's going to get revenge on the house of Atreus. So, and then of course, then there's the whole mess that Orestes gets caught up in, but it essentially effectively ends that particular kingly line by doing that. So this is the way in which things can be corrupted by cannibalism. Similarly, in the House of Thebes, with the myth of Oedipus, we see incest as being a corrupter of the family line, as well as murder and other things, but particularly that. So what does this all mean? And I bring up cannibalism because we are dealing with this idea of somebody who is hungry for, who thirsts. First of all, there's this idea of hunger and thirst, right, which connects us back to Tantalus. And then there's this idea of this kind of a thirst for human blood in particular. Now, she's not feasting on human flesh, but she is feasting on human blood. So, and of course she's a dead thing, so again, it's not quite the same, but the motif is still the same, because the motif is about the way that tension between that has to do with the expansion or contraction of the family. And when you have a father figure, we talk about the father who frequently devours the son or the nephew to try to keep that from that lineage from going forward. Let's think back to Greek myths where Kronos swallows his children, okay? There's this idea of we're not going to allow the succession by devouring the generation that comes after us, right? Now, again, this is not that kind of a story, but there's the idea that by trying to co-opt and contain the feminine power, the sovereignty of the female in this particular story, that both the father and the husband, in this case, first of all, she starves herself to death, so she has taken back her sovereignty in her death by being the master of her own death. And then when she returns, it's basically now she's taken on this devouring aspect. She's going to destroy the father. She's going to destroy the husband. She's not going to allow the continuation of the family line. She's going to curtail it in some way. And all of these stories of these kinds of taboos, engaging in behavior. And in this case, again, there's not actual cannibalism that goes on, but there's the idea of that with these arranged marriages, there's this idea that when the sovereignty of the woman is compromised, when she's forced into a position or a place that is not in line with what she wants, and of course then when she has to accept that situation, and then she is abused, then there's a consequence. This might also make us think of the stories of Macha and also the story of Rhiannon. Now again, horses are not involved here, but when we think of Macha at Ulster, she is a woman who becomes the wife of Cruniac. When he makes a boast that he shouldn't make, she is dragged out, and while pregnant and giving birth, she is forced to run a horse race because of the ego and the pride of the king. They have no mercy on her as a woman. She is a woman whose power and sovereignty is abused. And this is a woman who has granted sovereignty, who has granted prosperity in the case of that myth, and now it is taken away, and therefore that leaves a curse on them. Okay, and so at the hour of their greatest need, they are basically laid low. They are unable to help themselves. They're actually struck down with labor pains, something that I imagine a lot of men would have difficulty tolerating if they really had to live through it. And so they're unable to fight. So there's this idea of what happens when one abuses the feminine. That's really what the theme is. It's not so much about the horses per se, but even in the case of Rhiannon, I mean, that was a case where she was punished for a crime she did not commit, and forced to behave like a horse. You know, she had to carry people around on her back like a horse. You know, when there's always negative consequences to mistreating the sovereignty of the feminine. So I almost feel like, even though this is a tale where the woman is considered to be kind of inauspicious because, you know, she was given this arranged marriage with money, and instead she wanted to follow her own, what they would have considered to be her own lust, by going after somebody or wanting to be with somebody who was of a lower stature than herself. Because it's not about the feelings between people, it's about the economic arrangement. And and this talks a bit about the economic disparity as well. The idea of one supposedly marrying beneath them, and the way in which the father takes control of that, because the marriage is a business transaction. It's not actually about love in this particular case. And love, like female sovereignty, should this be a thing that it's not a thing necessarily to be controlled in this manner. But again, it's not that she married this man and that he was kindly to her either. There was an abuse that went on, so it's like a double indignity on the sovereignty of the female. You have to remember that Ireland certainly was a place, and certainly in Celtic times and probably before, where the sovereignty was granted by a woman. Okay, there was rituals where the kingship was conferred by a woman, who would offer the cup to the chosen sovereign. So in a way, again, I feel like tales, if this is really truly coming out of Celtic Ireland, then you are looking at a period of time where females would have had that sovereignty. They would have had the right to grant it. And that this attempt to crush and to take away female sovereignty due to this business transaction, the transaction of the dowry, that would have a very negative implication. Now, vampire legends in general are often connected to narcissism in psychology for the reasons that I had mentioned before. I feel like I've just sidetracked myself from that. But vampires are the idea of one that drains from another person. So in other words, it's somebody who's almost selfishly taking from another. It's not a symbiotic relationship where both people benefit. It's where one drains and loses something because the other one is taking it. And it is kind of interesting when you think about it in that light of how many feminine stories there are of women who drain the life out of men. We've talked about it like with the Lennon She in the context of the anima, the woman who, by her great beauty and her power of seduction, drains a man of his life and energy. But we also have this idea of the woman who, you could also look at it as, if the man is supposed to be the one to provide the dowry and take the woman on, it's almost like the idea that she is somehow, she's more of an accessory or a possession. She's something that takes resources and doesn't necessarily give, unless that giving is in the form of children. In this particular case, this woman did not bear any children to this man. She died before that would happen. And again, the nature of her death makes them believe that she is going to come back as a vampire, but perhaps because they felt badly for her, they didn't do that. And of course, then she got up and she had her revenge. Now, it's interesting that you can, that this placing stones on top of the grave is going to keep, again, there's this idea of keeping her down or trying to control the spirits. And I'm not entirely sure what that would be. I mean, and certainly in later times, it would have been the idea that piling those stones up, or actually putting a cross on the grave, or putting some other kind of, there'd be something else that one could put over the grave to to make sure that the dead person didn't rise. And they said this happened always on the anniversary of the death, is the way that this tale is told. But there's this idea that piling stones upon her, maybe it's the idea that with the stones on top of her, the body could not move under the weight of these stones, that it was something that would keep her in place, and if they were moved, then she would easily perhaps be able to get out of the grave. I was thinking about that. I was wondering if there was actually another representation of the stones. I can't find anything on that when doing research on it. If anybody has any idea in the comments about why stones would be placed on top of the grave, like there's another reason besides that, definitely leave me a comment about that. But it does seem to me that there's sort of two sides to this story. On the one hand, like I said, it could be, if you're looking at it from the social hierarchy perspective, it's almost like the punishment of a woman who now becomes this monstrous feminine for daring to want to assert her own sovereignty by marrying beneath her station, economically, marrying somebody who didn't have that same kind of power, but also the fact that she ends up, by her death, she has basically outwitted her husband and she's reclaimed her own sovereignty. Now she becomes a certain type of figure that is now a dangerous feminine figure. She's not been subject to her husband, not subject to her father. So one could look at it as a cautionary tale about the feminine. But again, as I've said, you can look at it from the other direction as well and say that this is the price of disrespecting the sovereignty of the female. You not only lose the father and the husband not only lose their breath, and everybody else in the household, by the way, they have their breath taken from them, which means that they die. But the husband she also drinks the blood of the husband. We go a step further, and now we have this kind of devouring of the families, and then this brings death on not only the husband but also on her own family. By denying the sovereignty of the woman, you turn the woman into the monstrous feminine. And think about that too, the idea of the woman who does not have her sovereignty being turned into a kind of monster. That's another way to potentially look at myths like that of the Loathly Lady stories, the Dame Ragnell stories, which I've done podcast on Dame Ragnell. But she's this ugly hag who lives in the forest. And when King Arthur comes upon her, needing to answer the question, what is it that women want in order to keep his life, she says, oh, I know the answer to that. She's like, but you have to let me marry. And I always get confused as to whether it was Galahad that she marries or whether it was Gawain. It was either Gawain or Galahad. It was one of the G's. And right off the top of my head, I'm not remembering. But in any case, the knight does agree to marry her. And when he does, and when he gives her back her sovereignty by allowing her to make a choice about her appearance and everything, because she appears to, once they're in bed together and he kisses her, she turns into this beautiful woman, and she says, okay, so do you want me to be a hag in the bedroom and beautiful outside of here, or do you want me to be a hag out in public and beautiful with you in the bedroom? And he says, well, it's your choice. So once she was given choice is a type of sovereignty. This woman in this particular tale is not given a choice. And when she's not given a choice, then it almost puts her under that curse because she doesn't have that sovereignty. It's interesting too, because I feel like this has something to say about family connections and ancestral connections as well. The way in which, we may belong to a family line where we maybe have a proud lineage, or maybe we have, a lot of good things that come out of our family, but we also have a lot of toxic traits and traditions and wounds that come out of the family as well. And oftentimes there are family patterns or corruptions in the family and then the family line that need to be corrected or that need to be simply not repeated. Okay, when somebody has lived through a situation where they have, where there has been, say, for example, a pattern of abuse in a family, like physical abuse, or there's just some other kind of traditional way that, let's say that families are, that parents may behave in a certain way. Let's just say you have parents who rule their children with an iron fist. And then those children go and have their own children, and they think that's the way that they have to parent their children. And then so on and so forth until someone breaks out of the pattern. You have families where if you have one person in the family who doesn't follow along with the script that everyone else in the family followed along with, then that person might be shunned by the family or exiled by them. And one of the hard things is trying to deal with rejection by the family, rejection of those people who are supposed to be your flesh and blood and who love you, and people who don't accept your sovereignty. When we talk about the family context, there is a lot of tension here because family is a collective unit. And when we talk about family, there is an element of the feminine to that, because the feminine, as I've said, is collective rather than individual in terms of its inflection. Like masculine, when a masculine with a capital M, at least part of the trait of masculinity is that drive towards individuality. I'm going to have my ambitions. I'm unique. I'm going to become someone. Okay. Now, again, that's a trait that men and women have. This is not like just a trait for men. But it is a masculine active trait. The collective is something about that centers on the family. That's why the woman is often considered to be the nexus of the family. Things center around mom and taking care of the kids, and really it should be mom and dad taking care of the kids. But if you go with these ideas around the feminine, femininity is collective. The thought process is collective. It's supposed to be about looking at community rather than just the individual. This, I think, is often why unconsciously women tend to be associated with being the ones who have to raise the family, because they are the ones who are interested in the collective, in keeping things together. But again, there's a lot of toxicity that can occur in family situations. And this toxicity is what tears things apart. It's when the previous generations seek to gain too much control over the generations that come after them. And when the idea of having a community becomes a more toxic form of community, where it's more about social conformity, which again really is more of a patriarchal imposition, because structures and rules and things like that, it's not about empathy and nourishment. I mean, you need both aspects of it. You need discipline, and you need that empathetic, caring, willing to accept people who make mistakes, willing to accept, things that maybe are not considered, that are considered to be sort of outside the norm or the tradition. That caring for somebody on a human level, versus what the strict rules are about the roles of everyone in the family and the roles that they're supposed to play. It's kind of not a really great argument for Confucianism, which is the notion that that playing your proper role in the family is what brings about harmony in society. So this isn't really quite that, but this is more the idea of the girl who doesn't want to obey the family structure, who doesn't want to simply marry, the person her father chooses at that station. But then her power is taken away. Her sovereignty is taken away. She marries this man, and this man abuses what he has. He has this beautiful woman, but she's not treated like a woman. She's treated like an object, and an object that he can abuse at his pleasure. So when she takes her sovereignty back, that's when she becomes that's when she's regarded as something monstrous. That's when she becomes a vampire. But really, this is this idea of that corruption there feeding on itself. Really, when you talk about lineage and family lines, when you move out of a value system that's just about the family, I talk about this in my book as oikos versus polis, because obviously I'm talking about ancient Greece and Rome. So the oikos is the family. Okay, so that's the household. That's the tribal household with the chieftain, the chieftain's wife, and the children, and then of course the marriages are arranged in a certain way to maintain this very aristocratic lineage, and that's where people claim lineages with gods and everything else. There's this lineage thing that goes on. When you expand outside of the local family unit, when you stop being tribal. We've talked a lot about this term now, and you start talking about the polis, where you are talking about a bigger community. You're talking about a city or a nation state, where you may have people from different tribes and different backgrounds all living in the same space. Now you're not talking about just the family anymore. You're not just focused on the oikos. And that's where the need for that individuality comes in, because now you are dealing with diverse groups of people, and this is not just about your family and your traditions, but how you fit into the broader society. Okay, so you could see almost that kind of attention too. This is somebody who wants to go outside of the normal family structure and outside of, she kind of defying those economic boundaries as well in terms of the social boundaries to claim her own sovereignty. But she's not allowed to do that. And the results is that she becomes this being that now feasts not only on the members of her family, thus killing off her family line. We don't know if that totally kills off her family line, but certainly it turns back and it places this kind of it places an end to her family and her family line, causes death, and also causes death to the husband. So it's like this idea of, I always feel like in Irish myth, there's this thing of needing to treat the feminine with the proper respect that it's owed, because not doing so brings a curse. Now, if I go back to the way that this story was told, it's told in a way that suggests, oh, she was a beautiful, fair, and kindly lass, but what came out of the grave was not her. And it's like, well, like she was replaced with some kind of demonic being or something like that. And there's the question there. Is she actually replaced with a demonic being? Or is this that aspect of femininity that appears when sovereignty is taken away? Okay, and why? And it kind of shows this almost patriarchal kind of battle between the will of the female and the will not only of the family but also potentially of the society. And the way in which that femininity is seen to be threatening and needs to be kept under control. There's this ideal of the woman in a lot of, certainly in certain religious ideas of women as being submissive to the husband, right? Of submitting her power, of yielding her sovereignty. But again, with the consequence that when that happens, that if you don't yield that, if she doesn't yield her sovereignty, that this is going to create a problem. That she has to be kept in her place. And like with this vampire, it's like she has to have these stones piled on top of her. She has to be in this particular position. And the question always remains as to why would you do that? It's where the idea of female sovereignty crosses over the line into the idea of possession. If you possessed a prize bull or cattle, you would probably fence it in or potentially, tie a rope around its neck or something to kind of keep it potentially reined in and keep it as yours. So I don't know, just some interesting reflections here on the power of the feminine here and the power of sovereignty and the way in which we see stories in which the feminine turns monstrous and turns devouring rather than creative. Okay, there was all this potential for her. And also, I guess that would be my last point here, is the thought that when we look at tales of women who die before they actually have families in a lot of these stories, like the Aori in ancient Greece. I know I'm comparing a lot to ancient Greece here, but that's the main context that I can easily pull from, just off the top of my head. That the Aori are women who die and they become assistants of the Furies, right? They become these underworld type beings who are part of the tormentors of the living. Those who don't follow certain boundaries, who don't honor, particularly those who don't honor either family ties, and particularly those connected to the mother, is what the Furies were connected to. So there's almost they become these Chtonic type of figures that are seen as threatening. And it's because they have not fulfilled what's considered to be their duty or obligation to accept the marriage and to start a family. Instead, she starves herself. She basically creates a kind of a famine or a kind of barrenness, and then she won't yield to her husband. So the idea that she's going to become this kind of underworld creature just by virtue of her not willing to follow the social script and follow along in the social structure and fulfill what is considered to be her social role and duty. So interesting little vampire tale here from Waterford. Just thought I would share that. It was on my list for this year, and I thought, okay, this is an interesting one. And like I said, we have talked about vampire tales before. We have talked about feminine figures who drain men of life. But this one's an interesting one because this seems to be the penalty or the price for denying the woman her sovereignty. And that's a double denial, because it's not only is she not allowed to marry the man that she loves, but she's also and really, okay, I'm sorry, I just keep thinking of all these things, but the fact that when we think about people who are considered to be of the lower classes, they are also tend to have a Chtonic element to them. They're more people of the earth. And so the idea is she's not allowed to indulge in that, she's not allowed to, have the expression of her soul, that Chtonic element that connects her to the earth, that might connect her even to this element that is out of these aristocratic heights that supposedly she lives in. That no, she has to be kept in that place. And so therefore she manages to get there herself on her own, but now she comes back as this figure that now is dangerous and now drags men down to that because she was denied her own sovereignty, because she was not allowed to blossom in the way that she would have, marrying her to an older man, marrying her to an abusive man. She's not going to flower. You've killed her. You've killed her soul, and you've killed her sovereignty. So she just simply decides she's going to, she's going to allow death to come. She's going to embrace the underworld, and then of course this leads to consequences. So anyway, interesting set of associations on that. I hope you found that interesting, enlightening, or intriguing. And again, if anybody has any other thoughts about the reason that stones are piled up, other than just to keep the person down, I'd be interested to know. Thank you so much for listening. If you do enjoy these episodes and you're not subscribed, if you want to subscribe to me either on Spreaker for the audio podcast or subscribe on your favorite podcast app. If you also could go to the Chthonia YouTube channel. I also have the video version. Some of you may be watching this as the video, in which case if you are not subscribed, it would be really helpful to me if you subscribe, hit the notification bell so you get notified when these come out. If you do want to support my work, I do have a Patreon, patreon.com/Chthonia. I thank my patrons at the beginning of the episode. That's part of the perk of being a paid member, in addition to getting early podcast episodes and extra podcasts, as well as some other things that, as they come up, I always give a little swag or merch to people who first sign on. So there's some benefits. You can check it out there to see what is offered. And again, another thank you to my supporters. You can follow me on social media at Chthonia Podcast, one word, on Instagram and on X. And again, just to note, I'm not on X very, very often. But if you are on there, I do at least post the podcast and certain updates. And it is Chthonia Podcast, two words, on Facebook as well. Thank you guys so much for joining me, and we'll see you in the next episode.